Did you know that 3 people were murdered after watching The Warriors in theaters? Real New York gangs charged the film crew $200 a night just to shoot on their turf. And here's the kicker. Paramount got so scared they pulled all their advertising after the first weekend. Look, the movie you think you know is built on secrets so dark that most of them have been buried for over 40 years. And today, we're digging up 20 facts about the Warriors that'll completely flip how you see this cult classic. Starting with number 20, and this one's wild because the entire movie is basically an ancient Greek war story dressed up in leather vests and subway graffiti. Before the Warriors became anything, the whole blueprint came from this ancient text called Anabasis by Xenophon, which tells the story of a stranded Greek army fighting their way back to the sea through hostile territory. And novelist Sol Yurick read that and thought, you know what would be cool? If we took that march through enemy lands and made it a night-long flight from the Bronx to Coney Island. Walter Hill ran with it when he made the film, doubling down on those classical parallels. So while you're watching gang fights and subway chases, you're actually watching a story that's been around for over 2,000 years, which most people have absolutely no clue about. The original Greek soldiers were 10,000 men trying to get home after their leader died, just like the Warriors trying to get back to Coney after Cyrus gets shot. And Hill even wanted to make this connection super obvious with an opening narration that would have explained the whole parallel, but the studio shut that down hard. Number 19, and trust me, this sounds fake, but it's 100% real. The production shot at night in areas where local gangs literally ran the streets, and director Walter Hill has gone on record saying they were always bribable, with the going rate being exactly $200 a night to work on gang turf. We're not talking about some Hollywood security setup here with guards and barriers and safety protocols. This was straight up protection money paid to actual criminals just to get the cameras rolling, and it really captures that lawless vibe of late 70s New York, where anything could happen and usually did. The crew would show up at a location with their equipment, and before they could even unload, local gang members would appear out of nowhere demanding their cut, and the production assistants had envelopes of cash ready to go, because this was just part of the budget, filed under miscellaneous expenses or location fees to keep the studio from asking too many questions. Some nights, they'd have to pay multiple gangs if they were shooting on disputed territory, and there were times when rival gangs would show up mid-shoot and the whole production would have to shut down while negotiations happened in the shadows. Secret number 18 is gonna mess with your head if you know this movie, because that massive gang conclave where Cyrus gathers everyone in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx wasn't shot in the Bronx at all. They actually filmed the whole thing in Riverside Park, Manhattan. But wait, it gets better, because the 96th Street chase uses 72nd Street Station. Those interior platform scenes were shot on abandoned platforms at Hoyt-Schermerhorn in Brooklyn. And basically, the movie's entire geography is this weird collage of whatever New York corners the crew could grab between dusk and dawn without getting shot or arrested. The production would literally scout locations during the day, find spots that looked right, then show up at night, hoping nobody had claimed the territory in the meantime. And if another film crew or a real gang or just angry residents showed up, they'd pack everything into vans and race to their backup location, sometimes shooting the same scene in 3 different boroughs over 3 different nights. Location scouts have since mapped out the real filming spots, and it turns out the Warriors travel through impossible subway connections, take streets that don't connect, and somehow teleport between neighborhoods that are miles apart in reality. Moving to 17, subway nerds have actually mapped out the Warriors' route and discovered something hilarious. The whole journey is physically impossible. After the Riff's meeting, when the team runs to 96th Street, they somehow slip through 72nd Street. Then their later escapes jump between boroughs in ways that no actual subway service would allow in a single night, not even if you had the world's best Metro card. But here's the thing. This isn't a mistake. It's Hill treating New York like this mythic board game where gangs are themed tribes, and normal geography doesn't matter, because it's all about the vibe, not the reality. Transit enthusiasts have created detailed breakdowns showing how the Warriors would need to transfer between 5 different lines that don't actually connect, wait for trains that stopped running at midnight, and somehow use stations that were closed for construction in 1979. The film basically creates its own subway system that exists in this parallel New York, where every train goes exactly where the story needs it to go, and time moves at whatever speed keeps the tension high. Number 16 involves the most famous line in the movie, which almost never happened because it was totally made up on the spot. David Patrick Kelly, the guy playing Luther, just grabbed some bottles from the boardwalk, slipped them over his fingers, and started doing that creepy sing-song thing while the cameras were rolling, completely improvising what became the most quoted moment in the film. Hill watched this happen, and his only direction was don't change anything, and boom, those 5 seconds Kelly invented became 50 years of people clinking bottles together at parties and sporting events. Kelly later said he was channeling this bully from his neighborhood growing up, who used to taunt kids in exactly that sing-song voice, and he'd been holding on to that memory for years, waiting for the right moment to use it. The bottles weren't even in the script. Kelly just saw them lying around the Coney Island location and thought they'd make a creepy sound, and the way he moves his fingers while doing it created this puppet master vibe that makes Luther seem even more unhinged. Professional athletes still do this taunt to opposing teams. DJs sample it in hip-hop tracks, and you can buy replica bottles online specifically designed for doing the Warriors clink. 15 takes us into costume nightmare territory, because the baseball Furies were originally just gonna wear Yankees uniforms, which makes sense, right? Costume designer Bobby Mannix drew them up as this nod to New York's obsession with baseball, but Hill looked at it and said, nah, needs more terror. Someone suggested face paint, and suddenly you've got this visual link to the actual Furies from Greek mythology, those ancient spirits of vengeance who punish the wicked, which is why that chase through Riverside Park feels less like a gang fight and more like you're being hunted by demons in pinstripes. The makeup team spent hours before that scene applying the face paint to each Fury, using a combination of grease paint and powder that would hold up during the intense chase sequence, but still look wet and fresh on camera. Each Fury had a slightly different paint pattern to give them individuality while maintaining the unified, terrifying look, and the actors playing them couldn't eat or drink for hours because it would mess up the makeup. The baseball bats they carry were specially weighted to look dangerous, but be safe enough for the actors to swing during the fight choreography, and fun fact, several of the Furies were actually professional dancers hired specifically because they could run in a coordinated, almost balletic way that made them seem inhuman. Number 14, Deborah Van Valkenburgh, who played Mercy, broke her wrist midway through shooting during a subway platform scene, which threw everything into chaos. The production scrambled to reshuffle the entire shooting schedule and wardrobe, and that oversized blue coat she wears in the second half of the movie that seems like such a weird fashion choice? Total accident? They needed something to hide her cast so they could keep filming, and every single scene after that injury had to be staged super carefully to keep that broken wrist hidden from the camera. The injury happened during a scene where she was supposed to be pushed against a wall, but the stunt went wrong, and she hit the concrete platform edge instead of the padded section they'd set up. Van Valkenburgh didn't even tell anyone she was hurt at first, because she was terrified of being replaced, working through the pain for hours until a crew member noticed she couldn't move her hand properly. The production insurance almost shut down the whole movie over this, and they had to bring in a special stunt coordinator to re-choreograph all her remaining scenes so she could do them essentially one-handed. 13 is where things got genuinely scary in the real world, because after the first weekend, theaters started reporting violent incidents that made national news, and Paramount absolutely panicked. Their response was basically unprecedented in Hollywood history. They yanked all radio and TV advertising immediately, shrunk print ads down to nothing, offered to pay for extra security at theaters, and even told movie houses they could cancel their bookings without any penalty whatsoever. Think about that for a second. A major studio basically trying to make their own movie disappear because they were terrified of what might happen next. 3 separate murders were linked to Warriors screenings in the first week alone, with reports of gang members showing up in costume to theaters and starting fights in the lobby. In Boston, someone pulled a fire alarm during a screening, and in the stampede to exit, multiple people were stabbed. A theater in Los Angeles had to shut down completely after rival gangs scheduled a fight in the parking lot during the midnight showing. Paramount executives were getting death threats. Theater owners were demanding the studio pay for metal detectors and armed guards, and there were serious discussions about pulling the film entirely and taking the financial loss. But number 12 shows how crazy the audience reaction really was, because despite Paramount basically abandoning the film and all the violence headlines, the movie was crushing it at the box office. Opening on February 9th, 1979, it immediately started pulling in millions, with newspapers writing these bewildered articles about surly kids packing theaters night after night, even though nobody was advertising the thing anymore. For a gritty R-rated film with 0 star power to perform like that, while the studio was actively trying to bury it, that just doesn't happen. The film made back its entire budget in the first week, and by the end of its run, it had grossed over 20 times what it cost to make, all through pure word of mouth and controversial press coverage. Theater owners who didn't cancel their bookings reported sold-out shows for weeks, with audiences coming back multiple times and quoting dialogue in the lobby. The controversy actually helped in some markets, where the dangerous reputation made it a must-see event for teenagers looking to rebel against their parents. Secret 11 is something most people watching never pick up on, but that disembodied DJ talking throughout the movie is doing way more than just playing music. He'll set her up as a Greek chorus, like in ancient plays where a group comments on the action, except here, it's Lynn Thigpen's lips and voice serving as the narrator who pushes the plot forward and becomes the voice of the city itself. You barely see more than her mouth the entire film, but that technique got copied by basically every urban thriller that came after. Thigpen recorded all her parts in a single day, sitting in a booth with the camera tight on her lips while she delivered these cryptic updates about the warrior's journey. The radio station she's broadcasting from doesn't actually exist. It's this mythical voice floating over the city that somehow knows everything happening on the streets in real time. Hill wanted her to sound like she was broadcasting from some underground pirate station that only the gangs could hear. This secret communication network that connected all the tribes across the boroughs. Number 10 hits different in 2025 because Hill cut a subplot about a gay gang called the Dingoes and still regrets it decades later. In a 2022 interview, he basically admitted the movie could have been way ahead of its time if they'd kept this matter-of-fact portrayal of a gay crew who were just another gang in the city. No big deal, no stereotypes, just warriors like everyone else. Remember, this was 1979, so having that in a mainstream movie would have been absolutely revolutionary, but instead, it ended up in the trash with who knows what other progressive ideas. The Dingoes were fully scripted and costumed, with their own unique look that played against expectations, tough guys who happened to be gay, rather than any kind of caricature. Test audiences in conservative markets freaked out when they saw the Dingoes in early cuts, and the studio demanded they be removed entirely, not even left as background characters. Hill fought for them, but ultimately lost that battle, and years later he'd talk about how the film could have been even more groundbreaking if he'd had the power to keep them in. 9 is pure behind-the-scenes drama that changed the entire movie, because Thomas G. Waits, who played Fox, was supposed to have this whole romantic arc with Mercy and be way more important to the story. But he and Hill got into it bad, like really bad, and Waits got fired midway through filming, forcing them to frantically rewrite everything and give the love story to Swan instead. And Fox's shocking death on the subway tracks? Yeah, that was their way of dealing with firing the actor. They literally killed the character because they couldn't stand the guy playing him. Waits was method acting to an extreme degree, staying in character between takes and picking fights with other actors to maintain the gang tension, which Hill initially encouraged until it went too far. The final straw came when Waits refused to do a stunt, claiming it wasn't what his character would do, and Hill fired him on the spot in front of the entire crew. They had to shoot Fox's death scene using a body double and clever editing to hide that Waits wasn't even there anymore, and all his dialogue in the latter part of the film was either cut or given to other characters. Number 8 will blow your mind if you grew up watching sitcoms, because Tony Danza was actually cast in The Warriors before Taxi came calling. He talks about it in his official Television Academy interview, how he was all set to be in this gang movie when the TV opportunity showed up and changed his entire life trajectory. So somewhere in an alternate universe, the guy from Who's the Boss is running through Central Park fighting the baseball furies. Danza was supposed to play either Vermin or Cochise, depending on which source you believe, and he'd already done costume fittings and some rehearsals when his agent called about the Taxi audition. The Warriors casting director was furious when Danza bailed, but obviously it worked out for everyone since Taxi made him a household name and The Warriors became a cult classic without him. 7 involves one of cinema's greatest voices almost opening the movie, because Hill wanted Orson Welles to do a 30-second narration that would frame the whole Greek myth angle. The studio freaked out, thinking audiences would be confused by an artistic introduction to a gang movie, so they killed the idea completely, though Hill did eventually add his own narration when he made the director's cut years later. But man, imagine Citizen Kane himself introducing you to the Warriors. Hill had actually written the narration specifically for Welles's voice, with these dramatic pauses and emphases that would have given the film instant credibility as something more than exploitation cinema. Welles was interested too. His agent had agreed to the fee, but Paramount executives thought it would make the movie seem pretentious and hurt its appeal to the teenage audience they were targeting. Number 6 still causes fights among fans, because the movie you saw in 1979 is not the movie Hill wanted you to see. The theatrical version had none of those comic book transitions or that opening scroll about ancient warriors. All that stuff got added in the 2000s for the director's cut, which some people love and others absolutely hate. The recent 4K release brought back the original theatrical version, and now you've got fans split into camps arguing about which one is the real Warriors, like it's some kind of religious debate. Hill spent years wanting to add these comic book elements because he always saw the film as a graphic novel come to life, but the technology and budget didn't exist in 1979 to do it properly. When DVD special editions became a thing, he finally got his chance to create the version he'd imagined, adding freeze frames that turn into comic panels and transitions that look like turning pages. Fifth Secret? That song in the city that plays at the end and gets stuck in your head forever was written specifically for this movie by Joe Walsh, not for the Eagles. Walsh recorded it for the Warriors soundtrack first. Then the Eagles heard it and decided to put it on the long run. But most people hearing it on classic rock radio have zero idea. It started as the theme for a gang movie about guys in leather vests trying to get home to Coney Island. The song was written after Walsh watched an early cut of the film and was inspired by the urban decay and survival themes, crafting lyrics that could work both as a gang anthem and a broader statement about city life in the late 70s. Number 4 landed in court when Rockstar Games made their Warriors video game, because they got most of the original actors back except Roger Hill, who played Cyrus, and he was not happy about it. Dude sued for $250,000 in 2006, claiming they used his likeness without permission, and it became this whole thing about whether video game companies could use actors' faces and voices from old movies, which was a huge deal back when gaming was becoming more cinematic. 3 is more geographic weirdness because those gritty Bronx scenes everyone remembers were actually shot in Queens and Brooklyn half the time. The orphans' confrontation happens in Long Island City. The cemetery hideout is in Brooklyn, not the Bronx. And whenever a neighborhood got sketchy or the permits fell through, they'd just pack up and shoot somewhere else entirely. So the Warriors' New York is basically this fictional city stitched together from pieces that don't actually connect in real life. Number 2 is for the hardcore collectors out there, because an actual screen-used Warriors vest just hit the auction block at Heritage Auctions, complete with documentation proving it was worn in the movie. These vests are like the holy grail for fans, since most of them got trashed or stolen during production. So seeing one with the leather front and that flaming Warriors patch still intact after all these years is genuinely special. Though good luck affording it, since these things go for tens of thousands of dollars when they rarely surface. And the number one weirdest secret about the Warriors has to be that President Ronald Reagan watched it at Camp David and liked it so much, he called Michael Beck personally to tell him. Beck has confirmed this story multiple times, and just think about how insane that is. The President of the United States watching a movie about street gangs battling through New York and thinking, yeah, I need to call that Swan guy and let him know I'm a fan. Reagan apparently loved action movies and would have regular movie nights at Camp David, but nobody expected him to connect with a violent gang film that had been condemned by moral watchdog groups across the country.